This represents our final offer.
The silence is a choice. Most civilizations do not understand this. They understand silence as an absence, as the space between words, as the quiet that exists before something is said or after something ends. They do not understand it as a strategy. They do not understand that a civilization can choose, deliberately and with full awareness, to say nothing for 40 years. To attend diplomatic functions and smile and trade and expand and build, and never once say the thing that matters most. Never once say, here is what we are. Never once say, here is what we have built. Never once say, here is what happens if you push us far enough. For 40 years, humanity chose silence. Not because they had nothing to say. Because the right moment had not arrived. The right moment arrived on the 417th day of the Galactic Summit. It arrived because the Syndicate of Nine civilizations, allied, representing the largest coalition of military power ever assembled in the known galaxy, issued a joint ultimatum to the human delegation. Comply or be removed. Those were the words. Comply or be removed. Ambassador Kael Marsh had been sitting in the same chair for 417 days. He had listened to 417 days of negotiations, proposals, counter-proposals, procedural motions, and diplomatic language designed to say everything except what it meant. Well, he had been patient. He picked up the ultimatum document, he read it once, he set it down. He looked at the representatives of the Syndicate of Nine. And for the first time in 40 years of human diplomacy, he said the thing that mattered most. The galaxy fell quiet before he finished his first sentence. Well, the Galactic Summit had begun 417 days earlier as a genuine attempt at something. Nobody could agree afterward on exactly what. The official purpose was the establishment of a framework for regional governance, a set of common rules applied consistently to the increasingly complex web of relationships between the 43 significant civilizations that occupied the known galaxy. The unofficial purpose, understood by everyone present, was the establishment of a hierarchy. Who was in charge? The Syndicate of Nine had been forming quietly for 6 years before the summit was called. 9 civilizations, some large, some mid-sized, all strategically positioned. Their combined military strength represented approximately 60% of all warships in the known galaxy. They had spent 6 years aligning their interests, resolving their internal disputes, and building the kind of unified command structure that turned 9 separate powers into something that functioned like one. Then they had called the summit, ostensibly to discuss regional governance, actually to demonstrate that they were the regional government. The other civilizations had attended because not attending was not a real option. 34 other significant powers, all of them understanding that the summit was not a negotiation. It was an announcement. Humanity had attended. They had sent one ambassador, Kael Marsh, 61 years old, 38 years in the diplomatic service, a man with the particular quality of stillness that came from decades of listening to things he disagreed with and saying nothing until the right moment. He had brought 2 aides. The Syndicate of Nine had brought delegations of 40 or more each. Several observers had noted on day 1 that humanity's delegation was small. Marsh had explained when asked that he found large delegations distracting. Nobody had known what to make of that. For 417 days, Marsh had listened. He had listened to the Syndicate's proposals, their frameworks, their governance structures, their definitions of sovereignty and authority and enforcement. He had listened to the other 33 civilizations debate and negotiate and gradually, inevitably, accommodate themselves to the reality that the Syndicate was in charge. He had asked questions, precise questions, the kind that required precise answers. He had filed procedural objections on 17 separate occasions, objections that were noted in the record and overruled by Syndicate votes. He had never raised his voice. He had never threatened. He had never said, humanity will not accept this. He had simply listened. And on day 417, the Syndicate of Nine grew tired of listening to him listen. They issued the ultimatum. Comply with the proposed governance framework, which would, in practical terms, subordinate human foreign policy, military planning, and resource allocation to Syndicate oversight, or be removed from the summit and treated as a non-participant in the regional order. Comply or be removed. Marsh read the document. He set it down. He looked at the assembled representatives of 9 civilizations with a combined fleet of 40,000 warships. He said, "May I speak?" The Syndicate representative, First Voice Tavath-san, gestured permission. And Marsh spoke. 40 years of silence. I want to explain something, Marsh said. His voice was conversational, the same voice he had used for 417 days of questions and procedural objections. No different, no louder. 40 years ago, when humanity first made significant contact with the broader galactic community, we made an assessment. The assessment was about what kind of relationship we wanted with our neighbors. He looked around the chamber. We had options. We could present ourselves as we are, fully, transparently. We could have walked into our first diplomatic meetings and said, "Here is our fleet, here is our capability, here is what you should know about us before we begin." He paused. We chose not to. First Voice Tavath-san was watching him with the expression of someone who had expected anger or negotiation, and was receiving neither. We chose silence, Marsh continued. Not deception, we answered questions honestly. We provided accurate information about what was asked, but we did not volunteer the things that were not asked. And why, Tavath-san said slowly, are you telling us this now? Because you've issued an ultimatum, Marsh said. Comply or be removed. He looked at the document. An ultimatum is a specific kind of communication. It says, we have assessed you and we believe the cost of non-compliance exceeds your capacity to absorb it. You've made that assessment. I want to make sure it's accurate. The chamber was very quiet. You've had 40 years of data about humanity, he said. 40 years of our visible fleet, our stated capabilities, our public economic output, our colonized systems. You've run your assessments based on that data. He folded his hands on the table. I want to tell you what that data doesn't include. What followed was 40 minutes. Not a speech, not a threat, not a performance. 40 minutes of precise, specific, documented information delivered in the same conversational tone Marsh had used for 417 days of questions. He began with the fleet. Not the visible fleet, the other ones. He described in general terms the existence of what humanity internally called the strategic reserve. Ships that had never appeared in any public registry. Vessels that had been built in facilities that were not on any map accessible to external observers. A force that had been accumulating for 40 years in the patient, methodical way of a civilization that had looked at the galactic community and decided early that it wanted to be ready for a conversation exactly like this one. He did not give exact numbers. He gave a range. The lower end of the range was larger than the combined fleet of the Syndicate of Nine. The chamber changed when he said that, not dramatically, subtly. The quality of attention shifted. The way attention shifts when people who have been listening politely begin listening carefully. As he moved to the gate network, he described, again in general terms, the infrastructure that humanity had been quietly constructing for 30 years. Not the publicly known transit infrastructure. The other network. The one built in uninhabited systems, disguised as various things, connected in ways that allowed rapid force deployment to any point in the known galaxy within minutes rather than weeks. He described the coverage. Every major population center in the known galaxy was within 4 minutes of a gate node. The chamber became quieter. He described 3 specific technologies that humanity had developed and not deployed. Not in detail, he was not conducting a briefing. In outline, enough to make clear that the weapons signatures that Korathi and Shivari and Peloran intelligence services had detected on scanned human vessels and dismissed or filed or chosen not to examine too carefully were real and were not the limit of what existed. Then he stopped. He sat back. He looked at the Syndicate of Nine. I want to be precise about why I'm telling you this, he said. Not to threaten, not to negotiate from a position of strength, not to change the terms of the ultimatum. He looked at Tavith-san. I'm telling you because the ultimatum assumes a calculation. Comply or be removed. That calculation requires you to know what removal costs. He paused. You didn't know, now you do. Silence. The decision, he said, is still yours. The chamber. The Galactic Summit chamber held representatives of 43 civilizations. In 417 days, it had never been completely silent. It was silent now. First voice Tavith-san of the Syndicate looked at Marsh across the table. Her expression, which had been professionally neutral for 417 days, had changed in a way she was aware of and could not entirely prevent. You're saying, she said carefully, that for 40 years you have been building M's. Marsh said yes, while appearing to be modest. He said yes. The fleet numbers you've described are approximate, he said. The actual numbers are higher. I gave you the lower end of the range because I didn't want to seem as though I was exaggerating. She processed that. Around the chamber, 33 other civilizations were processing it too. Some of them had been at the summit since day one, watching humanity's small delegation ask precise questions and file procedural objections. Watching the Syndicate dismiss those objections. Watching humanity sit quietly for 417 days. Some of them were reassessing what that patience had meant. Representative Ovat of the Kael Confederation, one of the smaller civilizations, who had been quietly accommodating itself to Syndicate authority for 300 days, spoke carefully. Ambassador Marsh, he said, the gate network, the coverage you described. Oh yes, Marsh said. Every major population center within 4 minutes. Approximately, yes. That includes Kel Prime. Oh yes. Ovat was quiet for a moment, and the Syndicate's core worlds. Oh yes. So when you say the decision is still theirs, he paused, you mean the Syndicate's decision, but the information you've provided is relevant to everyone in this chamber. All 43 civilizations, yes, Marsh said. I wanted everyone to have accurate data. Ovat sat back. Around the chamber, a shift was happening, not dramatic, not sudden. The slow tectonic shift of 33 civilizations recalibrating an assessment they had made based on 40 years of incomplete information. The Syndicate of Nine had spent 6 years building a coalition. 34 other civilizations had spent 417 days gradually accepting that the Syndicate was in charge. In 40 minutes, that architecture had become uncertain. Not because Marsh had threatened anyone, because he had provided information. First voice Tavith San requested a recess. The Syndicate of Nine met in a secure room adjacent to the main chamber. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Tavith San had been in politics for 32 years. She had negotiated treaties, managed alliances, built the syndicate from the ground up over 6 years of patient work. She was, by any reasonable measure, exceptional at what she did. She sat at the head of the table and looked at her 8 counterparts and said, "Assessments." They went around the tables. The military assessment came first. The syndicate's combined intelligence services had spent 3 hours pulling everything they had on human military capability and running it against what Marsh had described. The conclusion, they could not verify the specific numbers. The strategic reserve, the gate network, the specific technologies, none of it appeared in any intelligence database. Which was, the intelligence director noted, itself the most alarming part. If we can't find it, he said, it's because it was built specifically to not be found. That requires 40 years of deliberate concealment. That requires a civilization that decided, before we were even a significant power, that it wanted to be ready for exactly this scenario. They anticipated us, Tavith San said. They anticipated the category, he said, a coalition forming to establish regional dominance. They may not have anticipated us specifically, but they anticipated something like us. She was quiet. The diplomatic assessment was next. If the numbers are accurate even approximately, the ultimatum cannot be enforced. Removal from the summit is a meaningless threat against a civilization that can deploy a gate network to every population center in 4 minutes. A pause. And if we attempt military enforcement, we're looking at a conflict we cannot win. If the numbers are accurate, Tavith San said. The lower end of the range he gave us is larger than our combined fleet. If he was being conservative. He said he was being conservative. Silence. What does he want? Someone asked. Tavith San thought about that. 417 days of questions. Precise questions. Questions about governance structures, enforcement mechanisms, sovereignty definitions, resource allocation frameworks. Questions that, she now realized, were not the questions of a diplomat trying to negotiate better terms. They were the questions of someone who needed to understand exactly how the system worked before deciding whether to participate in it. I think, she said slowly, he wants what he's always wanted, what the questions were about. Which is a framework that treats human sovereignty as genuinely equivalent to any other civilization's sovereignty, not subordinate to a coalition, not subject to oversight that doesn't apply equally to everyone. She paused. He's been asking the same questions for 417 days. How are enforcement decisions made? Who has veto authority? What are the limits on oversight powers? Every question was about whether the framework was actually equal or whether it was structured hierarchy dressed as governance. She looked around the table. He already knew what we were building. He's been watching us build it for 6 years. He came to the summit to see if we would admit what it was. She paused. We didn't admit it. We issued an ultimatum instead. Quiet. So what do we do? Someone asked. Tavith San thought about 40 years of silence. About a civilization that had spent 40 years building something and saying nothing and waiting for the right moment. About the patience that required. About what it said about how they thought about time. About strategy. About the difference between winning a moment and building something that lasted. We go back in there, she said, and we listen. What 40 years built? The recess lasted 3 hours. When the chamber reconvened, Tavith-san looked at Marsh across the table. I have a question, she said. Go ahead, he said. The 40 years, the silence, the building, she paused. You said you chose not to volunteer information that wasn't asked, but someone made that choice. Someone decided 40 years ago that this was the strategy. Oh yes. Who? Marsh was quiet for a moment. A group, he said, small. They looked at the galactic community 40 years ago and saw what was forming, not us specifically, not the Syndicate. The pattern. The pattern of larger powers consolidating, smaller powers accommodating, and the space between growing smaller. And they decided to prepare. They decided to prepare, he said. And they decided that preparing meant two things, building capability and not announcing it. Well, because announcing it would invite others to build against it, he said. We've had this conversation before in various forms. The moment you reveal your full strength, you start an arms race. The moment you keep it hidden, you have something else. What? Options, he said. The option to reveal it when the moment is right. The option to use it at a time and in a way of your choosing. He looked at her steadily. The option to sit in a chamber for 417 days and ask precise questions and wait. Wait for what? For the moment when the calculation changed, he said. When the cost of silence became higher than the cost of speaking. She thought about that. The ultimatum, she said. The ultimatum, he confirmed. Comply or be removed, that was the moment, not because it was a threat we couldn't handle, because it was a statement of what the framework actually was. After 417 days of governance, language, and sovereignty frameworks, the Syndicate said, comply or be removed, that's not governance, that's hierarchy. He paused. And hierarchy was the one thing we spent 40 years making sure we'd never have to accept. Silence in the chamber. So what now, Tavith-san asked. Now, Marsh said, we build something real. He reached into his document folder. He produced a proposal, 73 pages. We've been working on this for 417 days, he said. It's a governance framework, actual governance, equal sovereignty, weighted voting on security matters, enforcement mechanisms with genuine oversight from all member civilizations, not a supervising coalition. He slid it across the table. It's not what the Syndicate proposed, but it's something that works. Tavith-san looked at the document. She looked at the 43 civilizations in the chamber. She thought about 6 years of building, about the coalition, about the architecture of the last 417 days, about 40 years of human silence, about what a civilization willing to be silent for 40 years, to build for 40 years, to wait for 40 years, was capable of when it finally decided to speak. She picked up the document. She began to read. The day the galaxy fell quiet. The Galactic Summit did not end that day. It continued for another 63 days. 63 days of genuine negotiation, not the performative negotiation of the previous 417, not the slow architecture of a predetermined conclusion. Actual negotiation between 43 civilizations with genuine stakes and genuine disagreements, and a human proposal on the table that, unlike the Syndicate's framework, had been built to address the specific questions Marsh had been asking for 417 days. The Syndicate of Nine did not get what they had come to get. They got something else. A framework that gave them significant weight. Their military and economic strength was real, and the framework acknowledged it without giving them unilateral authority. A governance structure that required genuine consensus on major decisions. An enforcement mechanism with oversight from a rotating council rather than a permanent supervising body. It was not what Hay had built 6 years to achieve. It was, several Syndicate members acknowledged privately, better than what they had built 6 years to achieve. because a framework that 43 civilizations genuinely accepted was more stable than one that 33 civilizations quietly resented. On the final day, when the framework was signed, First Voice Tavith San sat next to Ambassador Marsh at the signing table. She said quietly so only he could hear, 40 years. 40 years, he agreed. You never said anything. Nobody asked the right question, he said. She thought about that. What would the right question have been? He was quiet for a moment. Are you more than you appear? He said. That was the question. Nobody asked it because the answer seemed obvious. We appeared modest. The assumption was that we were modest. He paused. Nobody considered that we might have chosen to appear modest. She sat with that. What would you have said, she asked, if someone had asked? He smiled, a small smile. The smile of a man who had been waiting 40 years to answer a question that had never been asked. We would have said yes, he said, and we would have shown them. She nodded slowly. Would things have been different, she asked, if someone had asked 40 years ago? He thought about it. Probably, he said. We wouldn't have needed to build as much. We wouldn't have needed to be as ready. He paused. But the building wasn't a bad thing. Knowing what we have, knowing we can sit in a chamber for 417 days and wait because we can afford to wait, that's not nothing. She picked up her pen. She signed the framework. He signed it beside her. In the chamber, 43 civilizations signed what would become known as the Marsh Accord. Named in the records for the man who had sat quietly for 417 days, asked precise questions, and waited for the moment when silence had served its purpose. Outside, in the corridors and transmission networks and back channels of galactic diplomacy, the conversation that had been waiting 40 years began. It's not about what humanity had built, about why they had waited to say it, about what kind of civilization spends 40 years building something and says nothing until the right moment, about what that patience meant, about what other things might be waiting in the silence between words for the right moment to be said. The galaxy had many opinions. Most of them arrived at the same conclusion. Quietly, carefully, in the privacy of their own councils and assessments and strategic reviews, they wrote the same note in the margins of their humanity files. The note was short. It said, "Do not assume the silence is empty." In his quarters on the final night of the summit, Ambassador Kael Marsh wrote a brief message to the Strategic Planning Council back home. The message said, "Summit concluded, framework signed, terms acceptable." 40 years was the right amount of time. The silence held. He sent the message. He looked out the viewport at the stars. 40 years of building, 40 years of saying nothing, 40 years of attending functions and smiling and trading and expanding and waiting. Waiting for the moment when the galaxy was ready to hear what humanity had to say. The moment had come. The galaxy had fallen quiet to hear it. And now, in the quiet after the speaking, humanity would go back to work. Not in silence this time. In the particular kind of presence that came after you had said the thing that mattered most, and the room had understood it. The kind of presence that didn't need to speak loudly, because it had already spoken. And the galaxy, all 43 civilizations of it, was still quiet. Listening,